Good afternoon and greetings from the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. My name is Dr. Sarah Abosh Jacobson and I am the Chief Education Officer here at the museum. And I would like to thank you for joining us this afternoon for another installment of our Survivor Speaker Series. Today we will be hearing testimony from Ms. Rosian Zerner, who experienced the Holocaust while living in Lithuania. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors for today. The Summer Survivor Speaker Series overall sponsor is Ernst & Young LLP. And I'd also like to thank our community partners for this series, Avance North Texas, Communities Foundation of Texas, Educational First Steps, Faith Forward Dallas, George W. Bush Presidential Center, International Rescue Committee in Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Reach of Dallas, SMU Human Rights Program, and Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. And we thank them at every one of these sessions because without their assistance, a series like this simply would not be possible. So, before we begin, I wanted to let you all know that after Ms. Zerner speaks, we will open the floor to questions and answers. So if you look either at the bottom of your screen, if you're on a computer, or in one of the top left or right-hand corners of your screen, if you're on a phone or tablet, you will see that there is a Q&A icon. Please feel free to click on that icon and submit your questions for Ms. Zerner. You don't have to wait till the end of her talk to do so. And after she tells you her testimony for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes or so, we will then get these questions to her and she will answer them. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and I turn the floor over to Ms. Rosian Zerner.
Virtual hello to everybody. And I'm so glad to be here because I'm here as proof that miracles do happen. At a time when the whole world seemed to me intent of killing Jews, there were some that became the givers of life, my rescuers. And because of them, I now live my life in gratitude and would like to inspire others to become upstanders like they have been. I was born in Lithuania. It is a very small country that you can see on that map on the left. It's circled in red, and it is the largest of the Baltic countries, but it fits into Texas 10 times. And actually, the population of the entire country is only 6 million less than Texas. Texas is 29 million, and Lithuania is about 20, well, yeah, it's about that amount. But at one time, Lithuania ruled most of Europe. In the 14th century, it was the largest country in Europe. And it has some amazing things. Its language is now the longest living language on earth, actually. It's based on Sanskrit. And they say that the first university was in Europe. They say that the center of Europe is in Lithuania, and it boasts 6,000 lakes in this small country, which of course some of them are puddles. And it was also a very, very thriving Jewish community. In Vilnius, which was the capital of Lithuania at some time, was called the Jerusalem of Lithuania because there were so many religious and cultural aspects to the community of Jews there that they had a thriving and vibrant lifestyle. Kaunas, where I was born, which is called Kovno in Yiddish and Kovno in Polish and Russian, was into the capital when I was born. And Lithuania had a very small spurt of independence. It became also a big Jewish center of learning. There were over 100 organizations of Jews there. There were 40 yeshivas. There were all kinds of cultural institutions. And then it became the killing grounds. I had a very privileged life before the war. You can see me as a happy child in this next slide. On the left, I moved my mother, and very happy. We had a chauffeur with a 1935 Ford, if you can see the second slide, and with very, very low license plate because there weren't too many cars in those days. I'm there with my nanny in front of, I think, my grandfather's building in the center of Kaunas. And life was good. I remember all the wonderful summer vacations and delightful memories of that time. And then, of course, it all changed. It changed very rapidly. The next slide will show the Soviet occupation, which was very short-lived, but it already had some of the premonitions of what was going to happen, because the Soviets were also very anti-Jewish. But there you have a slide of the tanks rolling in. Then you have the next slide, which shows the German invasion, which is the Operation Barbarossa, and they established themselves in Lithuania. Now, even before the German Anschluss, the Lithuanians began murdering the Jews. There were 150 villages that became Judenfrei, which is without Jews, because their neighbors were murdering them. They were being murdered by anyone who wanted their spoils, anyone who was so inclined because it was allowed. The actual, my grandfather, who was well-to-do, was taken away from his apartment, and we never saw him again. And we were told that he was tortured before he was murdered at the 7th Front. My grandmother, who was elderly like I am now, stood in a bread line forgetting to wear her yellow star. And she was denounced, and we never saw her again. There was a situation in a garage called the Litukis garage, where 40 or so Jews were taken and beaten to death, and they actually had water hoses that were put into their throats until they exploded at some time. The horrendous, horrendous murders. And then the Germans started their systematic killing. The Kovno Ghetto, here are some pictures of it, was one of the first established. And it was a small ghetto and a large ghetto. It was divided into two. We were herded in there and allowed less than 10 feet a person of living space. There was no running water. There was no sanitation. There was the coldest winter on record, I believe, in Lithuania. I remember taking a glass of water and trying to get it melted from the snow and then get it quickly to my lips so that I would drink it before it melted again. And food rations were under 800 calories a person, but that was the official number. What happened was really much worse, and there was a great black market in food, and it was very, very sparse to do that. The killing actually started in October, which was just months after the ghetto was established. There was one big roundup, which was called the Gross Action, and about 10,000, close to 10,000 people were shot in one day, within almost hearing distance from where we were. We were fortunate. Both my mother and my father and I survived that, but the verdict was there. If we stayed there, we would all be killed, because the Germans ruled through fear, through intimidation, through lies, and we didn't know what was going on. We didn't know what this was all about. I mean, this was a ghetto supposedly for labor, and then it became the concentration camp called Kaunas by the Germans, and then the actual deportation, the killings began. So my parents decided that I must live. They were really my first rescuers. They started digging a hole under the barbed wire that surrounded the ghetto, and they did this painstakingly, timing the guards, timing the dogs, and trying to do little by little so that it would be big enough for a 6-year-old to crawl through. And one day they actually finished that hole, risking their lives every time they did this. They pushed me through, risking their lives again, and it actually happened. I was on the other side of that barbed wire, where one of my father's secretary was waiting for me in the shadows, and we ran over the bridge of the river to the other side and supposedly to liberty. But then she couldn't keep me because I was crying so much, and she was endangering her own life. She didn't want to do that. Fortunately, a group of journalists, friends of my mother's friend, took me in. They were Christian Scientists. Here's a picture of, on the right, of my father's secretary, Bronya. And also, you have some scenes from the Kovno Ghetto still. The shoes were found after the ghettos were razed. Both ghettos were totally destroyed. The smaller one first, after they first burned to the ground the hospital with all the nurses and patients and doctors inside. And then at the very end, they dynamited the actual little ghetto with grenades, and people were burned. About 2,000 people were burned or shot if they tried to escape. Those shoes are a picture of what was found on the grounds after liberation. And then I was the fortunate one, because right after I was able to escape, there was something called the Kinderaktion, where all the children were murdered, because the children and the elderly were disposable, and they were the first to go. So here is a slides of my rescuers, which I was fortunate to have. In the upper right, you can see a picture of me with a group of children that were saved by my main rescuer, Lida. You can see me with my hair growing back after it was shaved because of lice. You have other children that were saved by this woman who was like a saint, actually. I was calling her mother, and then Bronya, who's below there, would come in and pretend she was my mother because that was the excuse that I'm supposed to be with Lida because I was a bastard child of Bronya. And then my mother came to visit twice during the war. And so I had 3 mothers actually during the war. So it was a little confusing at the time. But they were total saints. The main rescuers were Christian Scientists who were also persecuted. And the Lida, whose farm I'm on, and in this slide you can see I went back there after the war, the house behind which I was hidden, the well where the water was coming from, and she was a farm owner, so we had food. That was the first time for a long time that I was able to have some nourishment that was appropriate. The photograph on the right, where I'm smiling, is one that was used by UNESCO as the poster child for United Nations Remembrance Day. They chose that photo from the museum in Washington, United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, because it showed a smiling child even during those horrendous times. And that is what got me through, actually, my positive attitude towards even the worst of times. The bottom left is a painting I did then, and it followed me because I was an arts history major, and I still paint and sculpt, and well, I did until recently. So that was my passion. So that was my contact there. We have then the invasion by the Soviets again. And to some, they were the occupiers. To me, they were the liberators. Because for sure, we couldn't have survived in hiding much longer. Lithuania is a small country. Everybody knows each other practically. And so here they're barreling in again. And that was when we became free, supposedly. My mother became the concertmeister of the Lithuanian Opera. My father, who's shown there in the slide on the upper right with me and my mother, became a partisan during the war. And my mother, he also left the ghetto as a French widow because she pretended that her husband was killed in action, and she had studied in Paris piano with Nadia Boulanger, and she passed like a French woman. So, and the left slide shows us after the war in Graz, which was a DP camp after the war. The displaced person camps where everybody was able to congregate after the war because nobody really had a country. Everybody was going back and forth to their countries. And they never wanted to stay in the same country that caused so much pain and danger and destruction. So we were on the way also. The bottom left slide shows my mother not doing piano, but in a accordion in this particular displaced persons camp. The next slide, we are already in Italy. Italy was a launching place for Palestine then, and we were thinking of maybe going to Palestine, but we settled in Italy for 6 years, and I loved it. Um, at first, it was very difficult. We had nothing. I mean, we slept on cement floors in the Jewish community center. We had very little to eat, and my parents sent me to Salvino, which was a place that Israelis bought that used to be a Nazi R&R camp, and it had marble floors. And now there's a great community in Israel just of the Salvino children. There I am in Italy with my dad and La Scala, where I studied, and with my brother on the right. He was born in Italy, like every Jewish family. Everybody's born in a different country, it seems, and it's not in every Jewish family, but that happened in my family. Then I came to America in 1951, had my 16th birthday on the SS Independence, and here are the passport photos also of my parents and my brother as we were coming in. And I have a new home in the United States. Here I am in the upper left at Columbia University. I graduated Barnard. And on the upper right are all my 4 grandchildren and family. Below is my granddaughter, Jana, the only girl in the family. And there's more grandchildren, and my roles in Barnard shows. In that show, I was a torch singer, a football player, and a chemistry professor. So, as I said, I tried to live my life in gratitude. So I've devoted more than a decade to giving back, and for my volunteer work, I received the first citation in Massachusetts from the Senate. That's the slide on the left. I received another citation from the governor of Massachusetts. And on the right, you see me with the president of Lithuania. And I am receiving the actual reward for my deceased rescuer, because I went to Lithuania and I made sure that all the rescuers were recognized. And so I come to the end of my time, and if you have any questions, I would welcome them. I want to thank the museum also for providing this fantastic virtual amazing thing to me that is still a mystery, but I appreciate all the work that the museum is doing, trying to keep the memories alive. Thank you.
Rosian, thank you so much for that. So we have a number of questions, and again, for anybody who would like to ask Ms. Zerner a question, please enter it at the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So the first question we have asks, what happened to your parents during the war? Could you give us some more detail about that, please?
I'll be happy to. I wanted to elaborate on that as well, because I really owe them my life, because they were the first rescuers, because they risked their lives. And my mother, who was in a work platoon, or whatever you call it, went out of the ghetto with them and took off her yellow star and walked out. And it worked for some reason. And then she started her life as a French woman. She had to go from place to place because people were suspicious of everybody in those days, and they had to get her. She probably had about 4 rescuers. It takes a lot of rescuers to rescue a person, because the safety issues every day. My father, who had also graduated from military school, decided he wanted not to die not fighting. He wanted to die because he didn't want to die. I mean, but it seemed like all the odds were against him. So he went to Vilnius, from where it was easy to go into the forest. I'm sure you might have seen some of the movies of the partisans. There were several of them. And they accepted him because he had a revolver and he knew how to shoot. So he spent his life doing that. Now, he had a German rescuer. He worked for a group by Fritz Zimmermann. I remember the name because we tried to find him after the war. And this is a German who just abhorred all that was happening in this war. And so one day he took my father and with his truck and he dropped him off outside the ghetto. And we tried to find him afterwards, and he was killed at the German front, so we never were able to thank him. So that is the story of wartime story of my parents.
Rosian, there's an additional question that's come in about your parents from Ashley. From Maura Fleming. And she asks two things. She wanted to know how your parents got in contact with your father's secretary, who became your protector. And then also there's another question about whether, in fact, after all of this, your parents survived the war.
Oh, yes. This is another miracle in my life, that my parents survived the war and we were an intact family after the war ended. 96% of Lithuanian Jews were killed. This is a huge, huge number. It's 10% of the entire population. The 4%ers don't usually have intact families. And I was one of the very, very fortunate ones that was able to have parents that unite with them after the war. So miracles just keep happening, and I welcome them, of course. Were there two parts of that question?
Yes. Ms. Fleming would also like to know how your parents were able to contact his secretary.
Oh, there was a very thriving black market going on between the ghetto and the Lithuanians. The Jews would give up all their jewels and silver and whatever they had in exchange for food. So communication was there. And Bronya would come and help us with some of that as well. And so the communication was there. We were very happy to have her do that initial step, but and she also gave me my wartime name, which was Irena Budreikaite, because I was supposed to be her bastard daughter, and she was ashamed to have me in her city apartment, so she put me out in the landowner's place in the woods, practically. So that was her role. But yes, that was a good question.
We have a question from both Ashley Harris and John D. Filippo. They ask, when did you move to Dallas? And more generally, what brought you to Texas? And what do you think of Texas and Texans?
Well, I'm still a little bit of a culture shock after almost 7 years here. But I've learned how to like black-eyed peas and say y'all. But I came to Texas because I have family here. I moved here from Boston, and it's quite a different lifestyle here than Boston. Everybody's so friendly. Everybody talks to each other. I have actually loved being in Texas. And besides, there's no snow here. And of course, there are tornadoes and ice storms or whatever, but I like it here. I'm very happy to be here, and there's much to do in Dallas that as soon as this COVID is over, I hope you'll all participate in, especially this museum.
And Rosian, what brought you to Dallas?
My family, yes. I have family here. I have a son, daughter-in-law, and 2 grandchildren here. I have another son in San Francisco, and I have 2 other grandchildren all over. They're the older ones. So this seemed to be very stable. And besides, my son here is a physician, so at my age, that is a comfort.
Rosian, we have a question from Ellen Leinoff-Ennis, and she would like to know what your religious practice was like as a child. Specifically, did you celebrate holidays? Do you remember going to the synagogue as a child? If you could detail that a little bit.
Well, I come from a long line of rabbis, but my parents were very secular, and I did not have a religious upbringing. My father, after the war, was very, very confused about God, I think, because his question was, how could God allow this to happen? So it's always been a direct conversation between myself and God rather than a participation in a communal life. And now that I don't have a car, it's even more difficult. So, yes. But I'm very respectful of the Jewish religion and the practice of Judaism. It's the old religion. It's the father and mother of all religions. Not all. I mean, there are Zoroastrianism and Hinduism and so forth, but it's the closest to the source as far as I'm concerned.
Rosian, Ginny Beatty would like to know if your brother is still alive, and if so, are you able to stay in contact with him?
Absolutely, Ginny. He is a delight. He's 12 years younger. He was always my little baby, but now he's almost getting up there. So he was born in Italy after the war, and he lives in Georgia, and we're in contact constantly. He has 2 children and a lovely wife, and we're very different and very close. Yeah.
This question is from Ty Friend. He would like to know, and this is more of a kind of political science question. So let me know if you're comfortable answering it. He says, with pressure from both the Russians and the Nazis, how was Lithuania able to survive as a country? And then he adds to that, even today. Although today, I'm assuming he means pressure from the former Soviet Union and not from the Nazis. Thank goodness.
Well, I'm not a scholar, but I can tell you that Lithuania has been a seesaw with everybody invading Lithuania, from the Swedes and the Poles and the Russians and the Germans many times. So you have a country that seems to be in the crossroads of different agendas. Right now, if I read your question correctly, Lithuania is very anti-Soviet because they were the first to really start the toppling domino effect for the Soviet Union in the 1990s. And now they blame the Jews for being pro-Soviet. And there's a lot of revisionism as far as the Holocaust is concerned in Lithuania. And it's a difficult situation because there's a good relationship between Lithuania and Israel, but there is also the history. And the history shows that there's been long-standing anti-Semitism in Lithuania, and it has taken on a different mantle, but it needs to be addressed.
Rosianne, Linda Hoover asks, how soon were you reunited with your parents after you escaped the camp?
Not soon enough, Linda, but what happened is my mother knew where I was. She actually came and visited me with a doll that she made out of scraps of wool that I cherished for the rest of my life until it disintegrated. It was my only toy during the war. And so she knew where I was. So she and I reunited afterwards quite soon. My father was in a different city. He was in different Vilnius, in Vilnius, which is not far in Lithuania. Nothing is very far in Lithuania. But he stayed in Vilnius because he was assigned an important position. And since he was a businessman and he was a partisan who fought with the Soviets to liberate, quote, Lithuania from the Germans. So I saw him less frequently and less. Right after the war, we connected, and it was almost like I had to reinvent myself because I had these three mothers and I had a different life, and I didn't know what was happening anyway. And what does this child at that age know? And so that's how we reunited. But thank you for asking. It was a joyous occasion.
Rosianne, Stephanie Riles would like to know, did you ever feel scared while you were in hiding? Did you have any sense of what was happening? And then more specifically, were you able to stay in contact while this was going on so that you knew that everybody else was safe?
Oh, that's a loaded question. But thank you for making me think. I was constantly in fear because I didn't know what I had done, whether I had been a bad girl or whatever. I didn't understand anti-Semitism. I didn't understand why people were getting murdered. I didn't understand what was wanted of me, and I was willing to do it because that's how children think at this time when they're so small. After the war, there were actually some studies made about some of the issues that survivors had, and fear is one of them that follows throughout life. Trauma and lack of trust sometimes, because you don't know who the other is that you're encountering. And you have a lot of questions that have never been answered at that time. So it was a very confusing and a very scary time and a very dangerous time. I don't know if I answered all the questions, but tried.
I think that's good. Susan Moger, or Mosier, I'm sorry, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, would like to know, when did you start to talk about your experiences during the Holocaust? She says, and rightly so, that it seems like many people did not talk about it until many years later.
You are so right, Susan. Yeah. I did not consider myself a Holocaust survivor until the year 2000. My parents were the Holocaust survivors. I was just a child. I didn't have any right to even think about that. And I went to a conference in New York, I think it was late 80s, I believe, of the child survivor community. And that opened my eyes to the fact that there were hundreds and thousands of people who were touched by this. And the scars were there, and we had to face them. So that's how I started exploring myself, and I found that I had blocked out my childhood. That's how I was coping with it. So I went back to Lithuania to retrace my steps, and I don't know if I opened a Pandora's box or what, but they really kind of, apologies, I guess it's coming back. I had to face it, and since then, I started volunteering on behalf of myself as well as other Holocaust survivors and the victims. And that has been my path for a long time now. Did there was more to that question though, no? Okay.
Rosian, John DiFilippo would like to know if there are any books that you particularly think are important to read to become somewhat knowledgeable about the Lithuanian Holocaust or the Holocaust in Lithuania. Let me rephrase.
I think maybe the best way for him to do this is to Google it or just go online, because different things resonate with different people. And I don't know which aspect John would actually like to face right now, but many have been written. There's been diaries that were written during the ghetto times in Kovno that are so really show the lifestyle there. But it depends if you want the historical aspect, the personal aspect. There's so much there. And then there are some survivors who have written books, and they're their personal experiences. So yes, there's much to choose from, but I'll leave it up to you. Okay.
And John, I would add, if you're exploring on the web, please do look at ushmm.org, which is the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They have an encyclopedia online, and you can look up Kovno or Vilnius or Lithuania more generally. Do the same thing at yadvashem.org and also search those terms, because those are good places to start. Okay.
Yeah. I also want to add that my family collection is at the museum. So if you punch in my last name, you'll get an avalanche of information. So,
you mean at the Holocaust Museum in
yes.
Washington?
Yes.
Okay, good. Jillian Conroy says that my daughter is watching with me and would like to know how many children you have. And I know that you kind of enumerated before. And as the second part of this, Jillian, says that she's curious what you would like us to instill in children to help them understand and prevent such terrible tragedies from occurring again.
All right, the family first. I'm now the matriarch of the family, and I had 2 boys. Then my firstborn had 2 boys. Then my brother had 2 boys, and then my baby boy, who's now in his 50s, had a boy and a girl. So that's the family picture. What I would like to instill in everyone, actually, that there is a way to make a difference and to be an upstander, a way to change the world, even if it's just around you. You don't have to make this big splash. You can just have a drop in the water, but that becomes a ripple, and it goes on and on and on in our cells, in our memories, in our actions. And every action for good that anyone does is creating good. And as a child, that seems enormous, but every day you can do something like that that is appropriate, that will help yourself and others. And just look at the other like yourself, basically, and accept the differences and respect them as well. So, after all, anti-Semitism is like racism when you think about it. And you have to fight injustices wherever they come into your path. So every action you take for good makes you a better person as well as a better world.
Okay, we have 2 more questions, and I think we'll wrap up. So the first question, they're similar questions that come from Ashley Harris and Maura Fleming. So Ashley and Maura, and both of them want to know if you see any similarities between anti-Semitic statements today and what you saw in Germany and or Lithuania in the 1930s? In other words, do you see similarities? Do you see differences? What do you think is going on?
Well, the similarity is the ancient hatred that has come to the surface, both on the left, on the right, and the middle is being influenced as well. The what was the second part? I'm sorry.
Do you see similarities between what you see
Oh.
now and what happened before, or do you see more differences?
Definitely. The denial of what happened aids in the new anti-Semitism. And the new anti-Semitism is more virulent and it's worldwide. And it involves people from all persuasions. So it's very scary to see how history can repeat itself without anyone having learned the lesson of what not to do. Because, well, Nostradamus predicted, as goes Jerusalem, so goes the world, and we're the keepers of Jerusalem. So I hope there's some optimism coming. I'm very, very scared because it reminds me too much of the days gone by.
One final question, Rosian, and then we'll wrap up. This question is from Caitlin Roberson, and she says the following. She says, "Thank you so much for sharing your story. I just moved from Boston this last weekend to work for Refugee Services of Texas. You are very inspiring. What can we do to better support displaced people? What do you think are the highest needs that you see currently?"
Oh, the highest need is basically to stop the confusion, to start talking one-to-one towards each other. It has become so politicized instead of a refugee situation that it is difficult to discern what can be done where, how, without falling into some kind of a trap. In the meantime, people are suffering, and that has to be addressed first. I'm not sure I have the solution. I don't know if the people in the highest places are looking for a solution, but I don't see anything except good people trying to do good for others. And you're one of them. Thank you. And welcome to Dallas.
Thank you, Rosian Zerner. Thank for so much for sharing your testimony and your experiences with us today. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us as well, and our sponsors. And please do join us again next Tuesday, August 11th, when we will hear testimony from a second-generation Holocaust speaker, Ron Schwartz, who will be talking about his father's experiences as a hidden child in Western Europe. Thank you so much, everybody.